The Sermon on the Mount has to be one of the most misunderstood sections in the Bible. People read from it things like hate is the same as murder, or lust is the same as adultery. It's a problem for you to cut off your hand or gouge out your eyes. Or they read things like when Jesus says, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. And they think Jesus is saying something like, try harder or do better or be better. But he isn't. What we call the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus teaching on the law. And he's not trying to get us to try harder. He's telling us that it's impossible. Despite your best efforts, you're never going to get it all right. You're going to fail when it comes to keeping the law. Unless you do better than the best, you fail. If you even fail to keep the smallest of the commandments, you fail. Unless you keep it perfectly, you fail. That's what Jesus is saying in the Sermon on the Mount. So trying harder isn't the right response, because despite your best efforts, you're never going to get it right. And if your approach to the Sermon on the Mount is to try harder, you're doomed before you start, because you're never going to get it right. But the answer isn't just to give up. It's to find another way to fulfill the demands of the law. And that's where Jesus comes in. And that's exactly what he is saying in the Sermon on the Mount. When he says this, he says, I didn't come to abolish the law. I came to fulfill it. Jesus fulfills the law and the demands of the law on our behalf. He comes and he said, he comes and he lives out the law. He never breaks a single commandment. He keeps it perfectly his entire life. And then he says to us, I will exchange my perfect record for your record that's all messed up, that's got all kinds of blemishes. I will give you my perfect righteousness, and in return, I will take your sinfulness and all the times you broke it. And then Jesus goes to the cross and takes our punishment. That's what the cross is. It's the fulfillment of the law. When it's a just requirement for those who break the law was the cross. And so Jesus takes that on our behalf, and then we get no condemnation, which is what he deserved for keeping the law perfectly. Please hear and understand what I'm saying and what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that we should just give up, that we shouldn't try to live a good and godly life. What I am saying is, I think what Jesus is saying, what Jesus is trying to get us to recognize, is that we're incapable of living a good and godly life. We need to stop fooling ourselves and recognize that that's true, that no matter how hard we try, we fail, to recognize that we really are the worst sinners that we know. That's what Jesus is saying in the Sermon on the Mount. I also think it's what Paul is saying in Romans 3 and in Romans 5, where he says the law wasn't given to make sin decrease. Actually, the opposite true is that the law was given so that sin would increase. That the law doesn't make it possible for us to live a good and godly life. It just points out that we're incapable of living a good and godly life, and that should cause us to turn to a different and better solution. And that's, again, where Jesus comes in. So our response to the law, our response to Jesus teaching on the law on the Sermon on the Mount, is not to try harder, but to recognize that we're incapable of keeping the demands of the law. Recognize that, hey, I do sin, I'm gonna fail despite my best efforts, and realize we need a better solution, and that's Jesus, and turn to him and embrace the free gift of righteousness that he gives to us. I'll see you next Sunday.